Chapter 25, Front Axles and Vehicle Alignment Factors, Day 1, Video number 2, Tie Rod and Bearing Inspection. One of the first things that we'll do when we do a steer axle inspection is before we even get into the steering knuckle itself with any of those measurements, there's some preliminary inspections that we want to do. First of those being the tie rod inspection, right? So here's an example of a tie rod end threaded into the cross tube. This cross tube transfers over, goes across the length of the truck, and now we've got another tie rod end on it that goes into the passenger side steering knuckle. A couple things to consider here is we'll have a right hand and a left hand thread tie rod end. So that one side is right hand, the other side is left hand thread. So when you spin that cross tube, each one of them threads out, so you make that proper adjustment. The cutaway here shows a clamp bolt or a pinch bolt clamp here, a pinch clamp here with a bolt that would run through it, and the slots or the split that is in the end of the cross tube. That is where the adjustment is held on the style. So with that pinch bolt loose, our clamp is loosened up, and now we are able to rotate the cross tube into and out of that tie rod and the threaded end. So this is the area. One of the inspections we would have is the top example is this is correct. The split is in the end of the cross tube. We want to see threads going all the way through that. That way, when we've tightened that pinch bolt down, we've got all that surface area and all that thread that comes together and holds that adjustment, right? Lower one here is the incorrect style. Maybe we've got the wrong cross tube, or we've purchased the wrong tie rod ends, and we don't have full thread engagement. So as you look at the end of that cross tube, the slot here, or the split, and you can see the end of the threads, right? We've got, we would stop there, we wouldn't get proper clamping, and would not be able to hold the adjustment properly. So figure out what's going on and get the proper tie rod in there. Another thing to consider here when we're doing our inspection here on our tie rod end, we've got a grease cert that's on the bottom of the tie rod. So when we apply grease, now we've got this rubber boot here that would now, it fills the cavities inside of the tie rod, but it also fills this boot, right? So one of the other inspections that we're going to make is visual inspection to make sure that boot does not have a tear. If the boot has got a tear in it, that allows grease to escape out and dirt to make its way into the tie rod end, work as an abrasive, and then start to wear that tie rod end out prematurely. Castellated nut with a cotter pin coming through to hold that the castellated nut from turning loose. So those are some of the items we'll look through on our tie rod in inspection. Lifting or using your arm strength to lift and pull up and down on that cross tube to see or feel if we have any play up and down in this tie rod end. So it is a ball in a socket. So if there's any wear that happens in there, you'll feel that motion in that tie rod end of moving up and moving down. Obviously, you want to do this before any loop, you grease that joint because the grease will come in and fill any of that the wear that happens in there, and you may get a false reading there as you're trying to check for play in that tie rod end. Another thing that we want to look at is wheel bearing inspection. Right, as we pull that hub off, we want to check to make sure that our wheel bearings are in good shape. The example that we've got here is obviously that this bearing has fallen out or fallen off of the end of the spindle. So during disassembly, either the technician wasn't ready for it, wasn't expecting it, that bearing come off the end of the spindle and fell down and hit the floor right here on the cage. So this type of situation would make this wheel bearing out of service. As that cage bends, what will happen is the the rollers here will be put out of their proper location. The spacing will not be proper, could cause excessive loading on some of these bearings and then cause failure in that circumstance. So any sort of damage to the cage would take this bearing out of service. One of the things to look for is pitting on the bearings itself. So a lot of times what guys want to do is look at all so here's the part of the bearing that goes over the spindle, and you'd have the individual rollers placed across here, and then the cage surrounding it and holding these rollers in place. Generally what a technician wants to do is take a look at all these individual rollers to see if he sees any pitting or anything like that on these rollers. So what I would suggest is not even look at that roller, the bearing itself, but once you've pulled that apart, take your rag and go in there and wipe clean the bearing race. So here's the bearing race where all these bearings ride. Wipe that clean, and if you see pitting and scarring like this, discoloration, bluing, anything like that, heat discoloration, if that bearing is going bad, anything that goes through those bearings will then be transferred onto this bearing cup. So very easily you can wipe that surface clean and see any evidence of wear from that bearing on the cup surface. You don't even need to look at the bearing and try and observe all these rollers and any kind of damage to those.